Greetings, friends. So I thought that I would try a new series where essentially, well, I guess not new, there's the Solar Plexus Clown Glider one, but it's a little bit different from this point forward. Today we're just going to be analyzing creepypastas and giving our thoughts on them. And I think that this one is rather interesting. So anyone who watched Family Guy, you'll notice that it used to not be particularly graphic or whatever, but season 8 was it really ramped up everything for no real apparent reason. I remember when I was young watching that when it came out, and it was really gross to the point where it kind of rivaled most horror movies. And I understand that sounds dumb if you've seen shock videos or whatever, but it was disgusting. Season 8 of Family Guy, and this story here is one that was posted to X, and now it posits a theory as to why this happened. So this story basically, it's supposedly, right, the explanation as to why that season was so over the top. So, without further ado, let's get into it, and then maybe I'll give it some thoughts afterwards. So, this story is informally called The Dark Side of Season 8. I will not say who I am. I will not say what position I held that allowed for me to be aware of this information that I'm about to share, and suffice to say, I don't hold that position anymore. I've read some of the letters directed at Seth and Fox complaining about Season 8 of Family Guy, and while I can't officially make these statements to any press, I don't want to stay quiet anymore. Many people feel that Season 8 was just off in an odd sort of way. For anyone who took note of Season 8 of Family Guy for the specific reason of elevated graphic violence, I wanted to say this. Seth MacFarlane was going through a lot during the times these episodes were written and produced. He was heavily involved in writing the episodes alongside series writers, several of which made comments later regarding his apparent state of mind during writing sessions. However, more recently, when looking for corroborators, my ex-coworkers denied Seth being involved as he was, as well as Steve. My ex-coworkers denied Seth being as involved as he was, as well as Steve, whom I'll explain in a bit. A number of scenes did generate a certain amount of negative viewer response. Peter's head getting crushed between two logs, for instance. But I'd like to point out that these images were no more graphic than the things you might see on other adult cartoons. In addition, there's been blood and gore in the series before. Typically, it's just more spread out over the season. However, if you feel that such imagery was out of place for the series, you were right. Editors cut nearly 2 hours of animated gore, violence, and abuse from Season 8, as well as rejected 3 proposed episodes featuring the character Quagmire's stalking, capturing, assaulting, and finally killing a woman who he kept alive for several days in his basement, Stewie developing a mind control ray that he tests on Brian, who he eventually uses to have relations with him. Stewie developing a mind control ray which he tests on Brian, though he eventually uses it to have relations with him. And Lois becoming pregnant for cheating on Peter in a 3-way with friends from college, confessing to him, and after they argue about what to do with the pregnancy, him performing home abortion on her using a coat hanger. The last episode was eventually rethought and made as partial terms of endearment, but was cut from air from the US despite being shown in the UK and being available on the DVD for the season. I'd like to point out the episode Doggone, in which Brian loses faith in his ability to write and accidentally hits and kills a dog with his car while drunk by crushing it in half. When he reveals this, everyone but Stewie laughs at him and mocks him, saying that no one cares. Stewie does mock him for a while, but when he realizes how serious Brian is about the issue, he stages Brian's death so that Brian can see the family mourn and feel validated. I suggest you watch this episode while keeping in mind that Seth often represents himself through Brian and Stewie. In this particular episode, I also believe the various dogs and their reactions to their environment reflect Seth's emotions. Early on, when I asked Seth about why he seemed to be emphasizing his use of Brian and Stewie, he just told me he was frustrated with the series so far, that he'd begun to feel like the earlier seasons were idiotic, that the fanbase were morons, and that he was stuck. his name would always be associated with Family Guy. He also told me that he was bringing in someone to help mature the material. He mentioned having worked briefly with the man before. The stressed, slightly manic tone of Season 8 culminates in Brian and Stewie, one of the most serious episodes of the entire series. There are no cutaways, and the titular characters behave in a way that seems to show them in their most distilled forms. Again, this episode was heavily censored and altered. The original script called for the scene in which Brian eats Stewie's stool to be shown, not just implied. Brian considers taking his own life because he feels like his life has no purpose, and Stewie saves him with their friendship. Following this episode, the tone evens out and things return to more or less normal for the series. There was nothing particularly occult or metaphysical regarding the circumstances around the making of Season 8. None of the writers or animators went insane. There were no mysterious deaths or possessions. None of that. For those of you looking for a twist or reason, I will say this. While Seth usually seemed tired outside of working, he did his best to keep up appearances at major events and gatherings. However, it was said that he often looked sicker or more listless in the presence of his consultant. I assumed this was the man Seth had mentioned to me earlier, and was reluctant to say no to suggestions made by said consultant, whom I'll call Steve. And he was reluctant to say no to any suggestions that said consultant, whom I'll call Steve, made. From what I'd gathered, he didn't really start making suggestions until around episode 3, but was talking to Seth in private about the series in general. He was silent for some time, almost absent aside from just sitting in, and then began to converse more actively with Seth and the co-writers by the middle of the season. While those who had to deal with Steve usually did seem irritated or perturbed by his presence, he did have some connections. Dwayne Johnson's brief appearance in episode 10, Big Man on Hippocampus, was attributed to Steve. And I was told Mr. Johnson, when jokingly asked by one of the crew on set how he got asked to do the scene, commented that he was only there because he owed a favor to Steve. He acted uncomfortable at the time, and even during filming the short. The short was done in one take, and he was not asked to do it a second time. From what I've heard, Steve was present and seemed pleased by the fact that Mr. Johnson was visibly uneasy. During one session, the second time I saw him in person, I did question Steve directly about a suggested plot, and when he turned to look at me, I was genuinely scared. I had no idea why. He'd never once threatened, swore, or made a personally violent move. I suppose it was the series of ideas regarding violence and gore that he pitched to Seth. I should mention that when others did protest suggested violence, Steve would typically switch to sexual themes, racism, mental illness, or just withdraw altogether until he could work in one of his themes again. The pitch I was concerned about was for a running gag. The question I asked was something along the lines of, I think that what we're doing might be a bit too much for one episode. April and Quahog. Blood is okay once, maybe twice in the episode, but showing the same man dying over and over again might be a bit much, don't you think? The gag being pitched was that Peter, at various points in the episode, runs over the same man, who, despite being whole and alive every encounter, is increasingly mauled every instance, with a different recurring character running over and screaming that the man was dead. Seth was unaccompanied to the writing sessions for episode 17, and he was much more energetic than I'd seen him in past months. He was almost celebratory, and it showed. He picked some of his favorite musical numbers from the series, cut or not, for the end of the episode, the plot of which seemed to have been a symbol for his own self-redemption. I've been unable to track Steve down since to find out more about him. No records exist within the company to show that he was ever officially signed on or paid, and I believe that he may have been privately hired by Seth. For what reason, I have no idea. I'm just glad to know that he's gone. So, that was the dark side of Season 8. And one thing that I noticed quite early on was how they mentioned that Seth had worked with him before. That leads me to believe that maybe Seth had sold his soul or something to this character, or that maybe he's supposed to represent the devil or some sort of demon, like an entity from Ars Goetia or something like that. I'm not entirely sure. Like Seth had made a bargain where he would trade part of himself in order to get something he wanted, which was this series to take off. And then it took off and he became angry with what he had been given. He felt like the deal wasn't good enough or something. And maybe this Steve character has worked with several people over time, celebrities, and that's why they got popular. Like maybe they sold their soul to him, and that's why they got The Rock on there, so that he could be on part of the thing or whatever, and that's why he owed him a favor. And I mean, like, I don't know, it's definitely interesting. And I also wonder why the Steve character would just have those dark themes. I mean, it kind of makes you think, doesn't it? It's like, what, did they hire the guy who made Oru Naito Rongu to write these or something? Did they hire Daisuke Yamanouchi or like Tamakitsu Anaru to make these episodes? I don't know. But overall, it's a pretty good story. Obviously, I don't think it's real. It'd be interesting if it was. But I mean, let me know what you guys thought of this. Like, I thought the story was pretty good. I'd rate it like maybe like a 7 out of 10, but you gotta obviously go into it knowing like it's a fictional story. But yeah, I mean, I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one.